Well, hello and good morning to today's drive. I was having a think about what to talk about today, and I kind of felt like talking about auditory hallucinations. Yeah. They are an interesting subject matter to discuss and not straightforward. It's not as simple as, oh, you hear voices, therefore you're psychotic. You know, psychosis is a holistic picture. It's characterized by often positive and negative symptoms. The negative symptoms kind of looking like social withdrawal and lack of motivation, avolition it's called, and kind of apathy, lack of emotional range, kind of an emptiness brewing. And that's the hard stuff to treat. That's where medicines don't do a great job. It's hard to treat the negative symptoms of psychosis, but there's some medicines in the work focusing on that. And the positive symptoms of psychosis, things like hearing voices, like having delusions. You can see that, but there's often a kind of character to the auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. And it's important to not only look at the whole picture when diagnosing something as serious as psychosis, but to really characterize the different symptoms. So an auditory hallucination, it can be very different between people. I've had people kind of talk about, what has been documented. The common types, I guess, are things like commentary hallucinations, where it's third person and people hear voices, sometimes of one person, sometimes of multiple people, kind of commenting on, or commentating even on what they're doing moment to moment. So that's not always distressing. It can sometimes be neutral. At times, some people like their auditory hallucinations, especially if they're very socially isolated and lonely. They might like having some voices. But much more often than not, voices are negative in content and often derogatory, and can also be second-person command hallucinations or second-person derogatory hallucinations, whether you hear the voices saying mean things like "you're a piece of crap," "you're this," "you're that." So it's second-person, it's directed, and those kind of voices can be very distressing. Another weird kind of version of auditory hallucinations is when people hear their own thoughts. Sometimes it's just before you have the thought, or at the same time you have the thought. What's that called? It's called Gedanken laut werden. It's the German word. Gedanken laut werden, I think. Someone in the comments will have to correct the spelling. And that's the phenomenon of where someone hears their thoughts out loud as they're thinking them, which could be very distressing, when your thoughts are leaking out of your head. That's an issue in ego boundaries, the self versus the non-self. Your thoughts are meant to be part of the self, but when you have a psychosis and you have issues in ego boundaries, your self leaks out, and you don't know where the boundary is of you and not you. And the other one is when you can hear your thoughts out loud, but it's just after you've had the thought. Like, gosh, I'm hungry. Gosh, I'm hungry. So you have the thought, gosh, I'm hungry, and then just after it, you hear it out loud like someone's saying it. That's called écho de la pensée. So Gedanken laut werden is a German term, and écho de la pensée is a French term. So there you go, a couple of European phenomenology terms for your Thursday morning. And I think understanding all the different types and sounds and content and styles of hallucinations are helpful in diagnoses, number one, and they're helpful in risk prediction, number two. So someone who has, different psychotic symptoms, things like passivity, where they feel their body is being controlled by an alien entity, They feel they're not in control of what their body does. If they have that plus negative, derogatory, command, second person, auditory hallucinations, well, be careful. That's a high risk situation. That's someone who doesn't have a sense of autonomy in their body, plus is having auditory hallucinations telling their body to do things. So dangerous things can follow, and whether it's to others or to themselves. Look, I don't want to get into too many specifics because a goal of these videos is not to discuss anything that could identify patients. But I've met patients who have cut off body parts because of voices that have told them that that's what they had to do, and they felt they weren't in control, and they didn't think they didn't think anything was wrong with it. They just cut off the body parts, and they bled everywhere, and they just kept going on with their day until someone else saw the blood and called an ambulance and got them to hospital. This was years ago, by the way, but it can be very dangerous. So auditory hallucinations are tricky because they're not always seen in psychosis. They're probably more often than not are seen as a post-trauma response. So if someone has complex PTSD and maybe a developing kind of borderline personality vulnerabilities, so we can talk about that in a second. But as a post-trauma response, people can develop negative second person, they can develop auditory hallucinations. I guess the key point to say is hallucinations are not always pathological. And I'm sorry I'm going to the definition now. I probably should have opened with this. But what is a hallucination? Well, a hallucination is a perception without a sensation. Formally, it's a perception without an object, but I prefer my definition. So when you think about the biology of human experience, you have different sensory modalities. You have also, by the way, you have about 20 or so sensory modalities, but we always talk about 6. To see, touch, feel, listen, whatever. But you can have hallucinations in any of those modalities. So visual, tactile, gustatory, which is taste, olfactory, smell, and of course auditory, which we're talking about today. So to hear things without having a stimulus is what an auditory hallucination is. But it's not always pathological. So it can occur as a result of extreme emotions. It can occur as a result of drugs. It can occur as a result of psychosis. It can occur as a result of post-trauma response and complex PTSD. You can see it in BPD. And so there used to be a term called pseudo-hallucinations, which is now not used anymore because it seemed to minimize the I think the reason is because people had the sense that it minimized the severity of their symptoms because it wasn't a real symptom. It was pseudo. It was a fake symptom kind of thing. But that's fine. I think the terms now is really about whether it's with or without insight. And look, pseudo hallucinations had 2 definitions. It was either auditory hallucinations with insight. So you knew that although you didn't control these voices, you heard these voices, but you knew that they weren't outside in the real world, that they were in your head, but they sounded like they were in the real world. Or they sounded like extremely intense thoughts that you couldn't control. So you had insight into the fact that they were a hallucination. And then the second definition for pseudo-hallucinations was voices that were inside the head. So not in the real world, but inside the head. So I think you need to piece together the whole picture, but when you have auditory hallucinations that are inside the head and you have maintained insight that they are not real in the sense that they're not being produced by a sensation, they're being just an internal perception, then that tends to not be a psychotic process. Because psychosis really often involves the blurring of ego boundaries, where you're not sure what's real, what's not real. And you often don't know you're psychotic, right? Because you don't know what's real, what's not real when you're having psychotic processes. So when there's insight into it, it's unless maybe it's being treated psychosis, but when it's like a first presentation, often if there's insight, it's probably most likely a post-trauma or a intoxication or something like that process. Probably not intoxication, more trauma. Because intoxication, you can lose insight as well. Or you're intoxicated, so probably don't have great insight anyway. But if it is a voice where you're talking to it, you're responding to it, you're following its instruction. Often I've spoken to people who are psychotic, and it's like I have to compete with the voice. I have to speak over their internal perceptions because they keep getting distracted while talking to me because they're talking to their voices. And I'm not real to them. And you can see when someone is psychotic that the room that they're in, like they're not in the room with you. They look through you, like you're just a vague thought in their mind, and what's happening in their mind is reality. Very scary stuff to be in that state. I would hate to be psychotic. That's why we treat it, because it's extremely distressing to lose the grasp on reality. And yeah, so auditory hallucinations can be really tricky. I guess they're not always voices, and sometimes they're just like sounds of different, like it could be murmurs or whispers, and sometimes it can just be like traffic or different kind of sounds like that. And often when you have someone with like a schizophrenia and they hear voices, when you treat the schizophrenia, you might get residual sounds. So it's the kind of baseline sound. And the goal is, sometimes, for 30% of people with schizophrenia, you're going to have residual symptoms. And the goal is usually to just get them to the lowest achievable level. And hopefully they can still function like to have a meaningful life with those residual symptoms. So, I remember a patient we started on clozapine, one of the most effective antipsychotics, and it got the voices down to a murmur, it was just people whispering in the background. And he was able to hold down a job. It was a kind of supermarket shelf packing kind of gig, but that was really good for him. I made it because that patient was withdrawn, hiding in his room because the voices were telling him to not leave his room. He was paranoid because the voices were saying that other people were going to get him, kill him. Which if he was not as kind-hearted, maybe would have made him violent. A lot of violence in psychosis is because of paranoia and voices telling them that they're in danger. Please always remember the risk of crime. So the people with mental illness are at increased risk of being victims of crime instead of perpetrators. Just remember that. I'm not stigmatizing, but in my line of work, in the wards where I work, I do have a non-representative sample of people with a history of violence. Anyway, two other interesting things that just popped into my mind around auditory hallucinations. Things called extracampine hallucinations and reflex hallucinations / functional hallucinations. So these are different forms of voices again. So they come in all different shapes and sizes, the human experience, I guess, comes in all different shapes and sizes. So extracampine hallucinations are when you're having a hallucination of something that couldn't possibly have a sensation. It's not possible to actually experience that. So obviously auditory hallucinations, hearing a derogatory voice saying you're a piece of poo or whatever, that's very possible because someone could be in the room saying that. That's a possible thing. But if someone might say, I can hear them whispering in Russia saying they're going to kill me. Well, that's impossible. I can't hear anyone in Russia right now. So that's extracampine. It's beyond the realm of the body. So that's the term we use for that, extracampine hallucination. And then the other two terms I was going to say, functional and reflex hallucinations. So in this case, functional is not used correctly. Like it's a weird use of the word functional, but anyway, we'll use it. That's just what we use. Functional is when where you hear voices or you hear auditory hallucinations in the sound of something else. So a classic is running water, where you hear running water, and in the water you hear the voices. You hear the voices. And then when the water stops, often the voices stop. So I had someone with a functional and extracampine hallucination where when she saw cars driving by, in the sound of the car, she could hear people whispering in the car about her, right? So that's impossible to hear someone whispering in a car that's going past at 80 kilometers an hour, but in the sound of the car is where she heard that extracampine hallucination. So it's functional and extracampine. This doesn't necessarily change treatment, by the way. It's just an interesting term to help us communicate between healthcare professionals. And then the reflex hallucination is when you see, when you have an auditory hallucination of a different modality that's triggered by a different modality's sound. So, well, a different modality of sensation. So let's just say sound. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay. So there's a lot of different types of hallucinations, and today we're just talking about auditory ones. But there's one called kinesthetic hallucinations, where you feel your joints ripped apart and turning, and like you have a hallucination of your joints twisting. It's horrible, right? It's torturous. But if you heard running water, which is an auditory sensation, and it triggered a kinesthetic hallucination, that's a reflex hallucination experience. And that's kind of a pathological version of synesthesia. Synesthesia happening when you have a sensation in one modality and you experience a sensation in another. So I have a friend who, when she sees the color green, might taste ginger. Or when she hears this melody, might see colors. Or when she sees numbers, she might feel tickles on her scalp. We all get it, by the way. The nail on the chalkboard, ooh, I'm getting it right now. That's a sound, right? When you hear the sound of the nails on the chalkboard, it triggers a different sensation, which is what? Which is a discomfort in your spine, for me at least. Nails on a chalkboard makes my spine just contract and tingle, and it makes me kind of have a grotesque aversive response. So sound is triggering a physical sensation. That's synesthesia. So anyway, as with all of my morning drive videos, I'm going off topic, but auditory hallucinations are complex and varied and need to be explored in depth, and they're not always psychotic, and can be, variants of normal experience. Okay. So they need to be explored, and if they're causing distress or functional decline, or it's causing people to have troubles at work or in their relationships, that's when you need to see a psychiatrist. Better earlier than later. And, as a positive symptom in psychosis, if it is a psychotic process, they respond relatively well. 60% of people will respond to, antipsychotic medication. 60% of auditory hallucinations should get better with antipsychotic treatment. And the last 30% to 40%, it's a bit tricky. Yet, we don't have all the answers for all the mental illnesses yet, but we're working on it. And I think that is it for this video. I hope you enjoy these videos, by the way. If you do, please consider leaving them a like. What's been interesting is these videos get much less views, but the people who watch them comment much more often and in much more detail. So if you're watching these, please leave a comment down below. If you've ever had any weird hallucinatory experiences, share your story. And subscribe to the channel, leave the video a like, because that way YouTube will promote it. And other than that, I just wish you all a beautiful day. All right, bye for now.